My mother-in-law passed away 10 years ago. She lived to the ripe old age of 93. She was a formidable woman, the widow of an old, prominent family, who managed to navigate the tumultuous period after the Second World War. However, on the day of her funeral, what I remembered was an image of her from a summer day long ago. I was adopted by distant relatives when I was 5 years old. My adoptive family had a lineage tracing back to colonial times and was well known in our small town in rural Nebraska. Then, the head of the family had passed away young in the war, leaving behind a 27-year-old widow, a young daughter, and elderly grandparents. They feared the imminent extinction of the prominent family. The grandparents and the widow decided to take in and raise a future husband for their young daughter. As it happened, I, a distant relative, was selected for this role. Today, this might seem an unthinkable story. However, it was just after the war, and many parents found it hard to secure a job and raise children. My adoptive family were landowners with farmland, and by the food standards of the post-war period, they were considered wealthy. My biological parents probably sent me away thinking it was better than letting both of us starve to death. Maybe they also had ulterior motives, hoping for some support from my adoptive family by giving me up for adoption. As an adopted child, I gradually became attracted to my mother-in-law, who is also a widow. She managed all the affairs of the house in place of her late husband and always had a stern face. Looking back now, I believe it was a sort of boyish crush, similar to the admiration a kindergarten or elementary school student might feel towards their teacher. During my school years, I remember being scolded by her quite often.
"You are the heir to this house, so behave properly."
I would often get into fights with my friends and misbehave at school, and every time I got scolded by the teacher, I would come home and get scolded by my mother-in-law as well. My mother-in-law at the time was a much more terrifying presence to me than any teacher.
"You're not very quick on the uptake, bro. You should try harder not to take off my mother-in-law."
My stepsister, who is my betrothed, laughed as she said that. According to my stepsister, she was quite adept at navigating around me and avoiding scolding from my mother-in-law. She would hide behind me to make sure she wouldn't get in trouble. Then, when I turned 22, as planned, I married my stepsister. From that point on, my foster mom became my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law was already over 40, but she was a beautiful woman, still bearing traces of her youthful features. By this time, the United States had also emerged from the post-war period of turmoil and entered a period of rapid economic growth, with the upcoming Los Angeles Olympics scheduled in a few years. It was a time when the entire United States was filled with vitality.
"That's a load off my shoulders."
On our wedding day, my mother-in-law chuckled saying that. Even though we both knew we would eventually get married, we were a rather awkward couple as we had grown up together, more like siblings. Having a childhood friend as a betrothed may sound enviable to some, but for those involved, it's not laughing matter. Knowing each other since we were kids, our relationship felt more brotherly and sisterly than romantic. Everything was awkward, even the act of making a baby was difficult. Looking back now, I believe that all that hustle and bustle was part of our happiness. Eventually, my wife, who had been eagerly awaiting, was blessed with a baby boy. However, sadly, our child passed away 2 days later. The medical facilities were not as advanced as they are today, and infant mortality rates were high. Childbirth was literally a matter of life and death, and it was common for a child to die at birth. My wife depressed and stopped eating, then, her postnatal recovery didn't go well. 2 months later, she followed our child in death. Her funeral was held under a cloudy and drizzling sky. I was too stunned to accept my wife's death and felt utterly useless. Although I was the chief mourner, my mother-in-law handled all the funeral arrangements, as if forgetting the sorrow of losing her daughter. After the funeral and the memorial service had passed on a humid night, my mother-in-law suddenly came to visit my room. She looked different from her usual stoic self. Her eyes were swollen from crying. Perhaps due to fatigue, her eyes were sunken, and her complexion was almost pale. I was taken aback by her appearance, which was hard to imagine from her usual strong demeanor. She looked so fragile, as if she would break if touched.
Her scent still lingers here, doesn't it?
With that, my mother-in-law scanned the room. My room was just as my late wife had left it, with only her remaining belongings. The dressing table she loved so much was particularly noticeable, a gift from my mother-in-law for our wedding. Sometimes, it even feels as if my wife might casually come back home and sit in front of the dressing table. For my mother-in-law, who can never meet her daughter again, this might have been an even more cruel scene.
I can't bring myself to throw them away yet.
I couldn't yet sort out my own feelings. My wife, who was a year younger than me, had always followed me around since we were little. In middle school, she'd blush whenever the neighborhood bullies teased her, but she still wouldn't leave my side. I'm not sure what's normal for other couples, but at the very least, I had too many memories with my wife. I imagine it was the same for my mother-in-law.
You'll need to look for a new wife too, you know.
My mother-in-law. I'm not ready to think about that yet.
Regardless of how you feel, it's my duty to keep this house going.
As she said that and wiped her tears, I couldn't help but feel angry. It felt like insensitive words to say to someone who had lost a woman who was both my wife and my stepsister. The thought that for my mother-in-law, what mattered most was the house, and our feelings, mine and my wife's, were secondary, stirred up more anger than sorrow.
I'm not ready for that kind of talk right now. Please, let's discuss remarriage once things have calmed down a bit.
Looking at me in my fit of anger, my mother-in-law muttered softly.
I thought, at last, I had fulfilled my duty.
Hearing those words, I pondered the burdens my mother-in-law had shouldered. The matriarch of a renowned, old-money family, known to all in town. A formidable woman known by everyone in the neighborhood. Was that her true character? She must have faced considerable challenges managing the household on her own, having lost her husband in the war. By this time, her parents were already deceased, and she was indeed the head of the household. Of course, she was able to maintain the house because of the inherited family wealth. She owned property, surviving solely on real estate income. However, to manage her household, my mother-in-law would have had to behave as strongly as any man. Not everyone in the world is a good person. There must have been people who approached her with intentions of tricking the widow and swindling her wealth. During my student days, there were often times when my mother-in-law would harshly dismiss visitors. She must have been determined to protect the inherited estate, making sure it would safely carry on to the next generation. From an outsider's perspective, these could seem like the luxury problems of the rich, but I don't know if my mother-in-law truly wished for this. It's like a curse. Because it appears to others that she wished for this life, it makes things even worse.
My mother-in-law, you have fulfilled your role admirably.
At my words, my mother-in-law made a somewhat puzzled face. She had to preserve the lineage of the esteemed family. This must have been a tremendous pressure for her. Having become a widow at a young age, she single-handedly raised my wife and me while also taking care of her elderly parents. My mother-in-law was always a dignified woman, but that also meant she could never show weakness to others.
I am alive and well. I am now the successor to this house. As long as I live, this house will not disappear. My mother-in-law, you have successfully fulfilled your role.
Saying that, I cradled my mother-in-law's face in my chest. When I was a child, she used to hold my head just like this. There must have been pressure on her to raise me as the heir to the house, but she was more than that. I believe she poured all her love into me.
You don't have to be strong anymore.
At my words, my mother-in-law began to cry out. She must have been in pain for a long time. She must have felt so alone. Her crying was the very image of a vulnerable woman she'd never let me see.
Thank you for raising me this far.
Tears welled up in my eyes as well. My mother-in-law and I aren't related by blood. But what is it? Even though there was no blood relation, my mother-in-law treated me as her real son. The person I am today is all thanks to her. She is my mother. I truly believed that from the bottom of my heart. Until then, I had always been aware of her as my mother-in-law, but at that moment, I felt like we truly became mother and child for the first time. After we both cried for a while, my mother-in-law suddenly pulled away from me and straightened herself. Her face was the familiar strong and dignified woman I always saw.
Thank you. I'm okay now.
Please don't push yourself. I'm not going anywhere anytime soon.
Upon hearing my words, I laughed, and my mother-in-law laughed along with me. It was the first time in a long while that I saw my mother-in-law's smiling face. Afterward, following my mother-in-law's suggestion, I remarried. My new wife happened to be my mother-in-law's younger sister, a woman of the same age as me. The woman who was once my foster mother became both my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law. From an outsider's perspective, our family might seem complicated. It could be seen as a tangled drama of a prestigious family. But for me, it felt natural. I was determined to put my mother-in-law at ease. With my new wife, we were blessed with 2 sons and a daughter, and while working as an office worker, I also took over the management of the family's real estate from my mother-in-law, leading a busy life. Times passed away, the world was no longer focused on the so-called old prestigious families. My daughter married a man of her choice, and my sons each moved to New York and started their own families. The curse of the prestigious family that had once tied down my mother-in-law had completely vanished with the passage of time. In her later years, my mother-in-law laughed a lot. She would delight in seeing her great-grandchildren and had a serene smile that was unimaginable in the past. People say that others become more gentle with age, but I believe that this was the true nature of my mother-in-law all along.